Welcome to the Whispered Ages. This episode is about surviving a medieval winter, a day in the life of a serf. We appreciate your support for this channel. Please consider liking and subscribing. Now on with the episode. The year is 1342, and England stretches out beneath a sky the color of pewter. The land itself seems to breathe differently in this age, slower, deeper, bound to rhythms that have nothing to do with clocks or schedules. In the villages that dot the countryside, time moves according to the sun's passage, the changing of seasons, and the ancient cycle of planting and harvest that has governed human existence since memory began. To understand what it means to survive a winter in this world, we must first understand the world itself. England in the early 1440s exists in a peculiar moment of relative stability, though those living through it would hardly describe it as such. The Great Famine that devastated the land between 1315 and 1317 has passed from living memory for many, though the older villagers still speak of it in hushed tones around winter fires. The catastrophic plague that will reshape European society entirely still lies several years in the future, an unimaginable horror yet to be born. For now, the kingdom carries on much as it has for generations, bound by customs and obligations that reach back to the Norman conquest and beyond. The feudal system that structures this society is not merely a political arrangement, but a complete way of understanding the world. At the summit sits the king, Edward III, whose wars in France and Scotland seem impossibly distant to the peasants who work the land. Below him, the great lords hold their territories, and below them, the lesser nobility and knights who owe military service in exchange for their estates. At the foundation of this entire edifice, quite literally supporting everything above, are the peasants, the villeins and serfs and cotters, who comprise perhaps 90% of the population. These are not categories that exist only in law books. They shape every aspect of daily existence. A serf is bound to the land, unable to leave the manor without the lord's permission, required to work a certain number of days each week on the lord's domain in addition to tending their own strips in the great open fields. They must grind their grain at the lord's mill and pay for the privilege. They must seek permission to marry, and upon death, the lord may claim their best beast as a heriot, a final tax on a life of labor. Yet within these constraints, serfs also possess rights, customary rights, that have accumulated over generations, and which even lords hesitate to violate openly. They have their strips of land, their share of the common pasture, their right to gather fallen wood and glean the fields after harvest. In the village of Thornwick, which we might imagine nestled in the rolling countryside of the East Midlands, these abstractions take concrete form in the lives of ordinary people. The village clusters around its church, a stone structure that represents the largest and most permanent building most inhabitants will ever enter. The priest's house stands nearby, and the manor house home to a lesser knight who holds this land from a baron, who holds it from an earl, who holds it from the king, rises at the village's edge. But the heart of Thornwick, like every such village, lies in the cottages of the peasants who work its fields. Among these cottages, distinguished from its neighbours only by the slightly larger garden plot beside it, stands the home of William Ashford. William is a villein, which is to say he is legally unfree, but possesses enough land, perhaps 30 acres scattered across the great fields in narrow strips, to support his family in years when the harvest is good. His wife Agnes came to him from a village 3 miles distant, their marriage having required payment of a fine to the lord for permission. Together, they have brought 5 children into the world, though only 3 have survived the dangerous passage through infancy and early childhood. Edmund, now 12 years old and increasingly capable of helping with heavy labor. Little Alice, 7, with her mother's dark hair and quick hands. And Thomas, just 4, still too young for real work, but old enough to feed chickens and carry small burdens. Their cottage would strike a modern observer as almost impossibly cramped and primitive. It measures perhaps 15 feet by 30, with walls of wattle and daub, a lattice of woven branches covered with a mixture of mud, straw and animal dung that hardens into something approaching weatherproofness. The roof is thatch, thick bundles of straw or reeds that must be regularly repaired and eventually replaced. There is a single door, low enough that an adult must duck to enter, and no windows in the modern sense. Only small openings that can be covered with wooden shutters or oiled cloth to keep out the worst of the weather while admitting some light. Inside, the floor is packed earth, worn smooth by generations of feet. The space is dominated by the hearth, a simple fire pit near the center of the room, with no chimney smoke rises to the rafters, and eventually finds its way out through gaps in the thatch, blackening the interior timbers over time, and filling the air with a perpetual haze that stings the eyes, but also helps preserve the thatch and discourage insects. What furniture exists is rough and minimal: a trestle table, a few stools, a chest for storing the family's few possessions. The family sleeps on straw pallets that can be rolled up during the day, huddled together for warmth under whatever blankets and cloaks they possess. This is home. This is the center of the Ashford family's universe, the place from which all labor begins and to which all labor returns. In summer, they spend most of their waking hours in the fields, and the cottage serves mainly as a place to sleep. But as the days shorten and the cold deepens, the cottage becomes everything: shelter, workplace, sanctuary. The daily rhythm of peasant life follows patterns that have remained essentially unchanged for centuries. Rising before dawn, the family begins each day with prayers, brief, formulaic, but genuinely felt. The Ashfords cannot read, like nearly all peasants of their time, but they know the Pater Noster and Ave Maria by heart, words learned from the priest and repeated so often they have become as natural as breathing. After prayers comes the breaking of the night's fast with whatever food is available, usually bread if they have it, or pottage left from the previous day's meal. Then work begins, and it rarely stops until darkness makes it impossible to continue. The nature of the work changes with the seasons, but its relentlessness does not. In spring, there is plowing and sowing. In summer, there is weeding, haymaking, and the first harvest of hay. In autumn comes the great harvest of grain: wheat, barley, oats and rye, followed by the slaughter of animals that cannot be fed through winter. And in winter, though the fields lie fallow, there is still work to be done. Threshing grain, repairing tools, mending fences, caring for animals, spinning and weaving, and simply surviving. The Ashfords exist within a web of relationships that extends far beyond their cottage walls. Their neighbors are not merely people who happen to live nearby, but partners in survival, bound together by the collective nature of medieval agriculture. The great open fields cannot be worked alone. Plowing requires teams of oxen that no single peasant family can afford, so neighbors must combine their resources. Harvesting must be done quickly before weather can ruin the crop, requiring many hands working together. Even the rhythm of daily life is communal. The village bell calls everyone to work, to church, to the important moments of collective existence. The church itself provides the framework within which all of life makes sense. The Ashfords understand their world through the lens of Christian teaching as interpreted by their parish priest, a man of limited education but genuine devotion, who shares many of the same hardships as his flock. The year is measured, not in months, but in saints, days, and religious festivals. Christmas, Easter, Whitsun, the feast days of local saints, these provide the landmarks by which time is reckoned. The church offers not only spiritual comfort, but practical assistance, a place of sanctuary, a source of charity in desperate times, and the only education available to those few village children bright enough to be noticed by the priest. Beyond the village, the wider world exists as a kind of rumor. William has been to the market town 8 miles distant perhaps a dozen times in his life, and he considers himself well traveled for it. Agnes has never been farther than the next village. They know that there is a king, that there are wars being fought somewhere far away, that great lords ride past occasionally on the road that skirts their fields. But these things belong to another realm of existence, as remote from their daily concerns as the lives of angels. What matters is the land. What matters is the weather. What matters is whether the harvest will be good or bad, whether the animals will stay healthy, whether the children will survive to adulthood. These are the questions that occupy the Ashford family's thoughts, the uncertainties that shape their prayers, the hopes and fears that fill the long winter nights. And it is toward one of those winters that we now turn our attention, as the year 1342 begins its slow descent toward darkness and cold. The signs begin to accumulate in late October, though to call them signs suggests a precision that medieval weather prediction did not possess. Rather, There is a feeling in the air, a quality of light, a behavior among the animals that experienced farmers learn to read over lifetimes of observation. The geese fly south earlier than usual. The squirrels seem more frantic in their gathering. Old Margaret, the village's eldest inhabitant at perhaps 60 years, pronounces that her bones ache in ways that promise a hard winter, and her predictions carry weight earned over decades of accuracy. William Ashford watches the sky each evening with growing concern. The harvest has been adequate but not abundant enough to meet his obligations to the Lord and the Church, while leaving his family with stores that should, in a normal winter, see them through to spring. But a hard winter is not a normal winter. A hard winter can stretch from November to April, can freeze the ground solid for months, can trap a family inside their cottage for weeks at a time. A hard winter can kill. The preparations begin in earnest. Every peasant family follows roughly the same pattern, dictated by necessity and tradition, but the specific circumstances vary. The Ashfords are neither the poorest nor the most prosperous family in Thornwick. They have 2 pigs, one of which will be slaughtered and salted before the deep cold sets in. They have a small flock of chickens that provides eggs when the hens are laying. They have a cow, shared with William's brother John, who lives 2 cottages away, which gives milk in summer and must somehow be kept alive through winter. And they have their stores, grain that must be threshed and ground as needed, dried peas and beans, some root vegetables buried in straw, a small amount of honey, and whatever else Agnes has managed to preserve or set aside. The first task is fuel. A medieval cottage in winter consumes wood at a rate that seems almost impossible, until one considers that the fire must burn continuously, not merely for cooking, but for survival. The Ashfords have the right to gather fallen branches and dead wood from the common land, but this right is shared with every other family in the village, and the competition is fierce. William and Edmund spend long days in the weeks before the first snow, ranging ever farther in search of fuel, dragging back branches and logs that they stack against the cottage wall until the pile rises nearly to the thatch. But even this may not be enough. In a truly hard winter, when snow lies deep and venturing out becomes dangerous, a family can burn through their carefully gathered stores faster than seemed possible. William knows families who have been reduced to burning furniture, to tearing thatch from their own roofs, to desperate bargains with neighbors who had more foresight or better luck. He adds to the woodpile, even when his arms ache and his back screams for rest. Agnes, meanwhile, focuses on the cottage itself. The wattle and daub walls have developed cracks over the summer, small gaps where wind and cold can penetrate. She mixes a fresh batch of daub mud, straw and dung, combined into a paste that stinks powerfully, but seals effectively, and works her way around the interior, pressing the mixture into every crack and crevice she can find. The children help where they can, little Thomas carrying handfuls of straw while Alice mixes the components under her mother's direction. The thatch must be inspected as well. William climbs onto the roof, testing for weak spots, adding bundles of straw where the covering has grown thin. A leak in the thatch during a winter storm can be catastrophic, letting in water that soaks bedding and stores, that turns the earthen floor to mud, that makes the already difficult task of staying warm nearly impossible. The animals require their own preparations. The pig that will not be slaughtered must be moved to the small lean-to attached to the cottage, where its body heat will actually help warm the human inhabitants, while the humans' fire helps keep the pig from freezing. The chickens will be brought inside as well, confined to a corner of the cottage where they will contribute their own modest warmth and continue laying at least occasionally through the winter. The cow, too large to bring inside, must be sheltered in the rough byre that William and John have reinforced with additional wattle panels. The slaughter of the second pig is a significant event, one that involves several families working together. Pigs cannot be fed through winter. There is simply not enough food, so those that will not be kept for breeding must be killed and preserved before the cold weather arrives. The process is efficient and thorough, wasting nothing. The blood is caught and made into puddings. The intestines are cleaned and used as casings for sausages. The fat is rendered into lard that will provide both cooking fuel and a precious source of calories through the lean months. The hams and bacon are salted and hung from the rafters, where the constant smoke from the hearth will help preserve them. Even the bladder is saved, cleaned, and inflated to become a toy for the children. As the first flakes of snow begin to fall in early November, the Ashford family takes stock of their situation. Their stores, carefully arranged along one wall of the cottage, represent the sum total of their margin against disaster. There is grain, wheat and barley and oats stored in rough sacks and clay pots. There are the dried peas and beans that will form the basis of countless meals of pottage. There is the salted pork hanging overhead, the small crock of honey, the bundle of dried herbs that Agnes has gathered through the summer. There are turnips and parsnips buried in straw in a corner, root vegetables that will keep for months if the rats can be kept away. Is it enough? William and Agnes exchange glances that contain calculations neither can quite complete. In a mild winter, yes, certainly. In a normal winter, probably. In a hard winter, the kind that old Margaret's bones predict. The kind that seems to be gathering in the leaden sky overhead, perhaps. Perhaps not. There is nothing to be done now but wait, and hope, and pray. The snow falls more heavily through the night. By morning, a white blanket covers the village, transforming the familiar landscape into something strange and beautiful and dangerous. The children wake to a world made new, and even in the midst of their parents' worry, there is wonder in their eyes. Winter has arrived. The hearth commands the cottage now, in ways that summer never allowed. During the warm months, the fire was utilitarian, necessary for cooking, certainly, but peripheral to a life lived mostly outdoors. Now it becomes the axis around which all existence revolves, the difference between life and death made manifest in flickering flame and glowing coals. The Ashford family's hearth is simple. A rough circle of stones set into the earthen floor, perhaps 3 feet across, positioned near the center of the cottage, where the smoke can rise most easily toward the gaps in the thatch. There is no chimney, no flue, no sophisticated apparatus for directing smoke or controlling draft. The fire simply burns, and the smoke goes where it will, which is to say everywhere. Modern sensibilities might recoil at the thought of living in constant smoke, but the medieval peasant family knew nothing else and had learned to adapt. The smoke stings the eyes, certainly, especially when the wind shifts and drives it back down into the cottage. Chronic respiratory problems were endemic among the medieval poor, and the blackened lungs found in excavated skeletons tell their own story. But the smoke also served purposes that partially compensated for its costs. It helped preserve the thatch, making it less hospitable to insects and somewhat more resistant to rot. It discouraged vermin from nesting in the rafters. And in the depths of winter, when every source of warmth mattered, even the layer of smoke that accumulated beneath the roof provided some small measure of insulation. The fire itself requires constant attention. Unlike a modern heating system that can be set and forgotten, a medieval hearth fire must be actively managed throughout the day and carefully banked at night. The Ashfords follow patterns that have been refined over generations. Patterns that balance the need for warmth against the need to conserve fuel. In the morning, Agnes rises before the others, her breath visible in the cold air, and coaxes the banked fire back to life. She has covered the coals with ash before sleeping, a technique that allows them to smolder through the night without consuming much fuel. Now she scrapes away the ash, adds small pieces of kindling, and blows gently until flames catch. Larger pieces of wood follow, and within half an hour, the fire burns strongly enough to begin warming the cottage and heating water for the day's first meal. The fire burns continuously through the daylight hours, though its intensity varies with need. When Agnes cooks preparing pottage or baking the rough bread that forms the staple of the family's diet, she builds the fire higher and hotter. When the family simply needs warmth, she lets it burn lower, conserving the precious wood. The children learn early that they must never let the fire go out entirely. Relighting it with flint and steel is possible but tedious, and in an emergency, a dead fire can mean disaster. Cooking over an open hearth requires skills that have largely been lost to the modern world. Agnes uses a variety of techniques depending on what she is preparing. The iron pot that hangs from a chain over the fire can be raised or lowered to control temperature, higher for simmering, lower for boiling. Bread is baked in the ashes, the dough wrapped in leaves, or placed in a covered pot and buried in the coals. Meat, on the rare occasions when fresh meat is available, can be roasted on a spit or stewed in the pot with whatever vegetables and herbs are at hand. The pottage that forms the basis of nearly every meal is a thick stew of whatever ingredients are available: peas, beans, grain, vegetables, occasionally a bit of meat or bone for flavor. It simmers in the pot almost constantly, with new ingredients added as others are consumed, so that the pottage of one day blends imperceptibly into the pottage of the next. The taste is monotonous by modern standards, but it provides sustenance and warmth, and in winter, warmth is flavor enough. As darkness falls early in the winter afternoon, the fire takes on additional importance as the family's only source of light. Candles exist but are precious, made from tallow or beeswax, and reserved for special occasions or genuine emergencies. For ordinary evenings, the family relies on the firelight alone, arranging themselves around the hearth in positions that maximize both warmth and visibility. This is the time of day when the cottage feels most like a home. The work of the day is done, such as it is in winter. The evening meal has been eaten, the family gathers close around the fire, and in the flickering light, the cramped and smoky cottage becomes something almost cozy. Agnes sits closest to the fire, where the light is best for the fine work of mending clothes or spinning thread. The distaff and spindle are never far from her hands in winter. The family's clothes must be kept in repair, and any surplus thread can be woven into cloth or traded for other necessities. Her fingers move with practiced ease, drawing out the fibers, twisting them into thread, winding the thread onto the spindle, all while her eyes watch the children and her ears listen to her husband's voice. William sits nearby, often working on some small project of his own. He is carving a wooden spoon to replace one that cracked, or repairing a leather strap, or simply staring into the flames and thinking about the spring planting that seems impossibly distant. His hands, roughened by a lifetime of labor, move with surprising delicacy when working wood, and the children watch with fascination as a shapeless block gradually becomes something useful, or even beautiful. The children arrange themselves according to age and temperament. Edmund, at 12, considers himself nearly an adult, and positions himself at the edge of the family circle, close enough to benefit from the warmth but far enough to assert his growing independence. Alice curls up close to her mother, sometimes helping with the spinning, but more often simply watching and listening. Little Thomas claims the warmest spot, directly in front of the fire, where he plays with whatever toys are available. A carved wooden horse his father made, a ball of rags his mother stitched together, or simply the endless entertainment of the flames themselves. And in these evening hours the family talks. They tell stories, some old, passed down through generations, others new, invented on the spot to entertain the children. They discuss the day's small events, the health of the animals, the state of the stores, the doings of neighbors glimpsed briefly during the day. They speculate about the weather, about when the snow will stop, about whether the winter will be as hard as old Margaret predicts. They pray together, the familiar words of the Pater Noster, rising with the smoke toward the darkened thatch. The stories they tell draw from a common stock of tales that circulates through the village and beyond. There are Bible stories, learned from the priest and retold with local embellishments. There are legends of saints and their miracles, of demons defeated and sinners redeemed. There are folk tales of clever peasants who outwit foolish lords, of magical creatures that live in the forest, of treasures hidden and found. And there are local stories, tales, of things that happened in Thornwick or nearby villages, of floods and famines survived, of ghosts seen in the churchyard, of the strange lights that sometimes appear over the marsh. Agnes has a particular gift for storytelling, and the children never tire of hearing her favorites. She tells of the green man who lives in the forest and watches over the village, ensuring that the trees provide wood and the animals provide meat. She tells of the fair folk who dance in meadows on midsummer night and steal away children who wander too far from home. She tells of Saint Edmund, the martyred king whose shrine lies far to the east, and of the miracles that occur for those who make pilgrimage there. These stories serve purposes beyond mere entertainment. They transmit the values and beliefs of the community, teaching children what to fear and what to hope for, what behaviors are rewarded and what are punished. They provide a shared imaginative world that binds the family together, a common reference point that will remain with the children throughout their lives. And they fill the long dark hours when there is nothing else to do, when the cold presses in from outside, and the fire provides the only defense against the night. As the evening grows later, the family prepares for sleep. The fire is banked carefully, the coals covered with ash to preserve them until morning. The straw pallets are arranged close to the hearth, and the family lies down together, sharing body heat under whatever blankets and cloaks they possess. The children sleep in the middle, where they will be warmest, with the parents on either side. Sleep comes slowly in a medieval cottage. The cold creeps in despite the banked fire, and the family shifts and adjusts throughout the night, seeking warmth. The animals make their own noises, the pig grunting in its lean-to, the chickens rustling in their corner, occasionally the distant lowing of the cow in the byre. Outside, the wind moans around the cottage, and sometimes the creak of settling snow can be heard. But eventually sleep comes, and the family rests, and the fire glows quietly in the darkness, and another winter night passes toward morning. Beyond the cottage walls, the world has been transformed. The snow that began falling in early November has continued intermittently for weeks, and now, in the depths of December, the landscape bears no resemblance to the green and growing place it was in summer. The fields at the Ashfords work their strips scattered across the great open expanse that surrounds the village lie, buried beneath a white blanket that conceals all the familiar landmarks. The furrows and ridges that mark the boundaries between strips, the paths that connect the village to its fields and pastures, the very shape of the land itself, all have vanished beneath the snow. The silence is perhaps the most striking feature of this transformed world. In summer, the countryside rings with sound. Birdsong, the lowing of cattle, the shouts of workers in the fields, the creak of cartwheels, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. Now the snow absorbs sound as effectively as it conceals sight. When William ventures outside to tend the animals or fetch water, he moves through a world that seems to have been wrapped in wool, muffled and deadened and strange. The cold itself is a physical presence, an adversary to be confronted with every step outside the cottage door. The Ashfords' clothing, adequate for the mild seasons, provides only limited protection against the winter chill. William wears a woolen tunic over a linen undershirt, woolen hose wrapped with strips of cloth, and a rough cloak that Agnes wove from the wool of their own sheep. On his feet are leather shoes stuffed with straw for insulation, and on his hands, woolen mittens that his mother made years ago. This is more clothing than many peasants possess, and still it is barely enough. Venturing outside in winter requires planning and determination. The door of the cottage, which opens outward, must sometimes be forced against drifted snow. The path to the byre where the cow is sheltered must be cleared after each snowfall, a task that falls to William and Edmund working together with wooden shovels. The well in the village centre, which provides water for several families, freezes regularly and must be broken open with an iron bar, the ice growing thicker as the winter deepens. The isolation that winter brings is both physical and psychological. In summer, the Ashfords see their neighbours constantly in the fields, on the paths, at the church, in the informal gatherings that mark village life. Now, each family retreats into its own cottage, and days can pass without any contact beyond the immediate household. When neighbours do encounter each other, at the well perhaps, or checking on the animals, the conversations are brief, conducted in the biting cold with breath visible in the air, before each retreats to their own warmth. This isolation weighs differently on different members of the family. William, accustomed to the hard physical labor of farming, finds the enforced idleness of winter difficult to bear. There are tasks to be done, certainly threshing grain, repairing tools, caring for animals, but they do not fill the long hours as fieldwork does. He grows restless, pacing the small cottage, venturing outside more often than strictly necessary, finding excuses to visit the byre or check the woodpile. Agnes adapts more easily, perhaps because her work continues regardless of season. There is always spinning to be done, always mending, always cooking, always the endless small tasks of maintaining a household. The cottage that confines William provides Agnes with a workspace where she can focus without the interruptions of summer, when the demands of the fields constantly pull the family in different directions. The children experience winter as an adventure, at least initially. The snow that threatens their parents' careful preparations appears to them as a wonderland, a playground of white that transforms the familiar village into something magical. Edmund and Alice venture out when the weather permits, their laughter carrying strangely in the muffled air, their footprints the first marks on pristine white expanses. They build figures from snow, throw snowballs at each other, slide down the small hill behind the church on improvised sleds. But as the weeks pass and the novelty fades, the children too begin to feel the weight of confinement. The cottage that seemed cozy in early winter grows cramped and stifling. The same faces, the same walls, the same view through the same small opening in the wall. The monotony wears on young spirits accustomed to the freedom of summer days. Quarrels break out over nothing, tears are shed for no reason, and Agnes must draw on reserves of patience to maintain peace in the small space. The psychological impact of winter isolation should not be underestimated. Modern scholars have documented the effects of seasonal affective disorder, the depression that can accompany short days and limited sunlight. Medieval peasants would not have had a name for this condition, but they surely experienced it. The long nights, the grey days, the constant cold, the worry about food and fuel, these combined to create a mental burden that was as real as any physical hardship. Yet the medieval peasant also possessed resources for coping that have largely been lost. The deep familiarity with the rhythms of the year, the knowledge that winter always eventually gives way to spring, provided a framework for endurance. The religious calendar offered landmarks to anticipate Christmas, with its promise of celebration. Candlemas in February, marking the midpoint of winter, the gradually lengthening days that signaled the slow return of light, and the simple acceptance that suffering was part of life, that hardship was to be endured rather than escaped, gave medieval people a resilience that their modern descendants might struggle to match. The landscape itself, for all its harshness, possessed a beauty that even the most worried peasant could not entirely ignore. On clear days, when the sun broke through the clouds and set the snow sparkling, the world seemed transformed into something from a fairy tale. The bare branches of trees, coated with ice, glittered like crystal. The smoke rising from cottage chimneys drew straight lines against the pale sky. The tracks of animals, rabbits, deer, foxes, wrote mysterious messages in the snow, stories that the observant could learn to read. And at night, when the clouds cleared and the stars emerged, the sky displayed glories that no modern city dweller can imagine. Without artificial light to dim them, the stars blazed with an intensity that seemed almost threatening, a reminder of the vastness of creation and the smallness of human concerns. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens, like a river of light, and the familiar constellations, the Plough, Orion, the bright star that marked the north, provided navigation points for a people who measured their lives by the sky. William sometimes stood outside on such nights, wrapped in his cloak against the cold, and gazed upward at the stars his father and grandfather had gazed upon before him. In those moments, the worries of winter receded slightly, replaced by a sense of connection to something larger than himself, larger than the village, larger than the concerns of any single human life. The stars had shone on England before the Normans came, before the Romans came, before the first farmers cleared the first fields. They would shine long after William and his family had returned to the earth from which they came. Such thoughts were not melancholy, but comforting, a reminder that the winter, however hard, was merely a season, and that the great wheel of the year would continue to turn as it always had. The stores that seemed adequate in November have diminished more quickly than William hoped. By late January, the careful calculations that he and Agnes made at winter's beginning have been revised downward, then revised again. The grain that should have lasted until March will be gone by mid-February at the current rate of consumption. The salted pork that hung from the rafters has shrunk to a few remaining pieces, carefully rationed to provide flavor for the pottage rather than sustenance in itself. The root vegetables buried in straw have begun to soften and rot, requiring Agnes to sort through them daily, salvaging what can be saved and discarding what cannot. The mathematics of scarcity are brutally simple. A family of 5 requires a certain amount of food each day to survive. The stores contain a finite quantity. When the one exceeds the other, the result is hunger. The Ashfords are not yet hungry in the desperate sense. not yet at the point where the body begins to consume itself, where weakness sets in and illness follows. But they are hungry in the constant gnawing sense that was the normal condition of the medieval poor in winter. They are hungry in the way that makes every meal feel insufficient, that makes the stomach growl an hour after eating, that makes sleep difficult and waking unpleasant. Agnes has begun to thin the pottage, adding more water to stretch the remaining ingredients. The bread, when there is bread, is smaller and coarser than before. The children receive the largest portions, a decision made without discussion between William and Agnes, who have silently agreed to feed their offspring at the expense of their own strength. This is not martyrdom but calculation. The children need food to grow, and the parents can survive on less, for now. The psychology of rationing is complex and corrosive. Every meal becomes a negotiation between present hunger and future need. Should they eat more today, when they are hungry, or save more for tomorrow, when they might be hungrier still? How do you explain to a 4-year-old why he cannot have more bread when bread still exists? How do you maintain hope when the stores visibly shrink with each passing day? William finds himself counting obsessively, counting the remaining sacks of grain, counting the days until spring, counting the meals that can be made from what remains. The numbers never quite add up, and the gap between what they have and what they need seems to widen with each calculation. He lies awake at night, running the figures through his mind, searching for some combination that will see his family through to the time when fresh food becomes available again. Agnes approaches the problem differently, focusing not on the abstract mathematics, but on the practical task of stretching each ingredient as far as possible. She has learned from her mother and grandmother a repertoire of techniques for making little seem like more. The pottage is seasoned with dried herbs that provide flavor if not nutrition. The bread is made with a mixture of grains that would have been unacceptable in better times, but that now seems merely prudent. The bones from the salted pork are boiled again and again, extracting every last trace of nourishment. The community dynamics of scarcity reveal both the best and worst of human nature. Some families, through better fortune or greater foresight, have stores that will see them through. Others, like the Ashfords, face the prospect of running short, and a few, the poorest cotters and landless laborers, entered winter with almost nothing, and now face genuine crisis. The village responds to this uneven distribution in ways that reflect its complex social bonds. There is sharing, certainly neighbors who have more passing small amounts to neighbors who have less, loans of grain that both parties know may never be repaid. The church collects alms and distributes them to the most desperate, though the amounts are never enough. The lord of the manor, according to ancient custom, is supposed to provide for his tenants in times of extreme need, though the extent of this obligation is always contested and its fulfillment always grudging. But there is also hoarding, suspicion, and the quiet hardening of hearts that scarcity breeds. Families that share too generously risk running short themselves. Families that receive charity feel the sting of obligation and the shame of dependence. The bonds that unite the village in good times are tested by the pressures of bad times, and not all of them survive intact. The Ashfords occupy a middle position in this social calculus. They are not desperate enough to require charity, but neither are they comfortable enough to offer it freely. William has helped his brother John, whose stores ran short earlier, with a small loan of grain. He has received in turn a promise of labor in the spring, when John will help with the ploughing in exchange for what he has borrowed. These arrangements are common, part of the intricate web of obligation and reciprocity that holds the village together. The children, mercifully, are somewhat shielded from the full weight of their parents' worry. They know that food is scarce, they feel it in their own stomachs, but they do not understand the calculations that keep their parents awake at night. They complain of hunger, as children do, and are told that spring will bring plenty, as parents always say. They accept this, mostly, because children are resilient, and because they trust their parents to provide. But the hunger affects them nonetheless. Little Thomas, who was plump in autumn, has grown thin, his cheeks losing their roundness, his energy diminishing. Alice, always slight, seems to shrink into herself, her eyes larger in her narrowing face. Even Edmund, on the verge of adolescence and needing food for growth, moves more slowly than he did, his usual restlessness dampened by the body's need to conserve energy. The adults feel the effects even more acutely. William's strength, which he needs for the heavy work of maintaining the household through winter, begins to flag. Tasks that would have been easy in autumn now leave him winded and aching. Agnes finds herself dizzy when she stands too quickly, sees spots before her eyes when she bends to tend the fire. These are the early signs of malnutrition, the body's warning that it cannot continue indefinitely on what it is receiving. And yet they continue. They ration and stretch and make do. They tell themselves that spring is coming, that the worst is almost over, that they have survived hard winters before and will survive this one. They pray for mild weather, for an early thaw, for the miracle of abundance that never quite arrives. And they watch their stores shrink, day by day, toward a reckoning that draws ever closer. Despite everything, the cold, the hunger, the isolation, the worry, life continues. The human spirit, resilient beyond all reasonable expectation, finds ways to assert itself even in the darkest circumstances. The Ashford family, like countless families before and after them, discovers that survival requires not only physical sustenance, but nourishment of a different kind. The routines that structure their days provide a framework for sanity. Morning prayers, spoken together in the cold cottage before the fire has fully revived, connect them to something larger than their immediate circumstances. The familiar words of the Pater Noster, repeated so often they have become almost automatic, nonetheless carry meaning. Give us this day our daily bread. The prayer is not abstract theology but desperate petition, and the family speaks it with an intensity that some are never inspired. After prayers come the small rituals of the morning. Reviving the fire, preparing the first meal, feeding the animals, checking the stores. These tasks, repeated daily, provide structure and purpose. They must be done regardless of how the family feels, regardless of hunger or cold or despair. And in the doing, they provide a kind of comfort. The comfort of routine, of knowing what comes next, of having something concrete to accomplish. The children, especially, need these routines. Their world has shrunk to the cottage and its immediate surroundings, and the predictability of daily patterns provides security in an uncertain time. Thomas knows that after breakfast he will help feed the chickens. Alice knows that she will spend the morning helping her mother with spinning. Edmund knows that he will accompany his father to check on the cow and clear snow from the path. These expectations, modest as they are, give shape to days that might otherwise blur into formless grey. Agnes has developed a particular genius for finding small pleasures in the midst of hardship. She saves a tiny portion of honey, carefully hidden from the children, and produces it on especially difficult days, stirring it into their pottage as a surprise that transforms the ordinary into something special. She teaches Alice songs that her own mother taught her, simple melodies about springtime, and flowers that seem impossibly distant but that plant seeds of hope nonetheless. She tells stories with extra enthusiasm on the darkest evenings, her voice carrying the family to distant lands and magical adventures that make the cramped cottage feel, for a few moments, like a palace. William, less naturally expressive than his wife, shows his love through action. He carves small toys for the children during the long winter evenings. A horse for Thomas, a doll for Alice, a set of knucklebones for Edmund. These projects, undertaken with the scraps of wood left over from more practical tasks, occupy his hands and his mind while producing objects that delight their recipients. The toys are crude by any sophisticated standard, but they are made with care and given with love, and the children treasure them. The games that the children play provide entertainment for the whole family. Edmund has learned a version of chess from the priest, played with pieces carved from bone and wood on a board scratched into a flat stone. He teaches Alice, who proves surprisingly adept, and their matches become evening entertainment that even the adults watch with interest. Thomas is too young for chess, but has his own games hiding objects for others to find, counting games that Agnes uses to teach him his numbers, simple contests of skill that can be played in the small space available. Religious observance provides another source of comfort and structure. The Ashfords cannot attend church as regularly in winter as they do in summer. The walk to the village church is difficult in deep snow, and the unheated building offers little warmth, but they maintain their devotions at home. William leads the family in prayers morning and evening, using the words he learned as a child from his own father. Agnes adds prayers of her own, petitions for health and safety and sufficient food, spoken in the simple English that God surely understands even if the priests insist on Latin. The approach of Christmas, despite the hardship of the season, brings a welcome focus for anticipation. The great feast of Christ's birth is the most important celebration of the winter, a time when even the poorest families are expected to make merry. The Ashfords have saved what they can for the occasion. A small amount of better flour for special bread, a piece of the salted pork that has been set aside, a few precious items that will make the day feel different from all the others. The village itself prepares for Christmas with what enthusiasm it can muster. The church is decorated with whatever greenery can be found, holly and ivy. Their bright berries and leaves a reminder of life persisting through the dead season. The priest prepares special services, and even families that have been isolated for weeks make the effort to attend. For a few days, the normal grimness of winter lifts slightly, replaced by something approaching celebration. Christmas Day itself arrives cold and clear, the sun bright on snow that sparkles like scattered diamonds. The Ashfords rise earlier than usual, dress in their best clothes, which is to say their least worn and patched, and make their way to the church for the morning mass. The building is crowded with villagers who have emerged from their cottages for the occasion, their breath visible in the cold air, their voices raised in hymns that echo from the stone walls. After the service, the family returns home to the feast that Agnes has prepared. It is modest by any objective standard. The special bread, the piece of pork, a pottage enriched with the last of the dried herbs, a small amount of ale that William obtained from the village brewer. But after weeks of thin pottage and careful rationing, it seems like abundance. The children eat until they are full for the first time in weeks, and even the adults allow themselves to eat without counting, without calculating, without worrying about tomorrow. The afternoon passes in games and stories and simple contentment. William tells the children about Christmases he remembers from his own childhood, embellishing freely until the past seems like a golden age of plenty. Agnes sings carols that she learned from her mother, her voice thin but sweet in the smoky air. The children play with their new toys, and with each other, their laughter, a sound that has been too rare in recent weeks. As darkness falls, and the family gathers around the fire for the last time on this special day, there is a moment of peace that transcends the circumstances. The cottage is still cold, the stores are still diminishing, the winter is still far from over. But for this one evening, none of that matters. The family is together, they are fed, they are warm enough, and they are alive. In the grand scheme of things, in the perspective that Christmas is supposed to provide, this is enough. This is everything. The peace of Christmas fades quickly as January deepens, and the true test of winter begins. The weather, which had been merely cold, turns bitter. The snow, which had fallen intermittently, now comes in storms that last for days, piling drifts against the cottage walls and making any venture outside an ordeal. And the stores, which had seemed to be lasting, suddenly appeared desperately inadequate. The crisis, when it comes, arrives not as a single catastrophic event, but as an accumulation of smaller disasters. First, 2 of the chickens die in a single night, victims of a cold snap that penetrates even the relative warmth of the cottage. Their loss means fewer eggs, which means less food, which means the remaining stores must stretch even further. Then the cow falls ill, refusing to eat and producing no milk, and William must make the agonizing decision about whether to slaughter her now for meat or hope she recovers. The family's own health begins to fail. Little Thomas develops a cough that keeps him awake at night and leaves him listless during the day. Agnes, worn down by weeks of worry and insufficient food, succumbs to a fever that confines her to her pallet for several days. Even William, the strongest of them all, finds himself weakened, his movement slower, his breath shorter, his body's reserves depleted by the long siege of winter. The mathematics of survival, which William has been calculating obsessively for weeks, finally deliver their verdict. At the current rate of consumption, the stores will be exhausted before February ends. Spring, with its promise of fresh food, is at least 6 weeks away, probably more. The gap between what they have and what they need has become unbridgeable. William faces this reality alone at first, unwilling to burden Agnes while she is ill, unable to share such news with the children. He lies awake at night, turning the problem over in his mind, searching for solutions that do not exist. He could beg from neighbors, but they are in little better condition. He could appeal to the Lord, but the Lord's charity is uncertain, and comes with obligations that William dreads. He could try to find work, but there is no work to be found in the dead of winter. He could sell something, but they have nothing worth selling that they can afford to lose. The answer, when it comes, arrives from an unexpected direction. William's brother John appears at the cottage door one morning, stamping snow from his feet and bearing news. The Lord's steward has announced that any tenant willing to work on repairs to the manor house will receive payment in grain. The work is hard hauling stone, mixing mortar, laboring in the cold, but the payment is generous by winter standards. John has already signed on, and he has come to ask if William will join him. William hesitates. The work will take him away from the cottage for most of each day, leaving Agnes alone with the children, while she is still recovering. The labor will be exhausting, demanding strength that he is not sure he possesses, and the arrangement feels uncomfortably close to the extra labor that serfs owe their lords, labor that William resents even when it is legally required. But the alternative is watching his family starve. William agrees. The following days blur into a pattern of brutal labor and desperate hope. William rises before dawn, eats what little breakfast Agnes can provide, and walks through the snow to the manor house. There he joins a crew of equally desperate men, hauling stones and mixing mortar, and doing whatever the steward commands. The work is backbreaking, made worse by the cold and by bodies weakened by weeks of insufficient food. Men collapse regularly, and those who cannot continue are sent away without payment. William endures. He endures because he must, because his family depends on him, because the alternative is unthinkable. Each evening he returns to the cottage with a small measure of grain, payment for the day's labor, and Agnes adds it to their dwindling stores. It is not much, but it is enough, barely enough, to close the gap between what they have and what they need. The crisis mobilizes the community in ways that isolation had prevented. Neighbors who have been confined to their own cottages for weeks emerge to help each other. The priest organizes a distribution of alms, collecting what the better off can spare and distributing it to those in greatest need. Even the Lord, motivated perhaps by genuine charity or perhaps by the practical need to keep his tenants alive, releases grain from his stores for distribution to the most desperate families. The Ashfords receive help from unexpected quarters. Old Margaret, who has somehow survived more winters than anyone can count, appears at their door with a small pot of honey and advice about treating Thomas's cough. William's brother John, despite his own difficulties, shares a portion of his payment with his brother's family. The priest visits to pray with Agnes during her illness and leaves behind a small loaf of bread from the church's stores. These acts of kindness, small in themselves, accumulate into something larger. They remind the family that they are not alone, that they belong to a community that, for all its tensions and divisions, ultimately stands together against the common enemy of winter. The bonds that hold the village together, strained by weeks of scarcity and isolation, prove stronger than the forces that threaten to break them. Agnes recovers slowly, her fever breaking after several days, and her strength returning gradually over the following weeks. Thomas's cough persists but does not worsen, and the other children remain healthy despite everything. The cow, against all expectation, recovers as well, beginning to eat again and eventually producing a small amount of milk that seems like a miracle. And the days begin, almost imperceptibly, to lengthen. The change is subtle at first, so gradual that it might be imagination rather than reality. But William, attuned to the rhythms of light after a lifetime of farming, notices that the sun lingers a few minutes longer each evening, that the darkness comes a little later, that the quality of light at midday has shifted almost imperceptibly toward something warmer. February arrives, and with it the Feast of Candlemas, marking the midpoint of winter. The church celebrates with special services, blessing candles that will be used throughout the coming year. The symbolism is not lost on the congregation. Light returning, darkness receding, the promise of spring encoded in the lengthening days. The weather remains cold, the snow still deep, the stores still precarious. But something has shifted in the family spirit. The worst, they begin to believe, is behind them. They have survived the darkest days, the deepest cold, the most desperate hunger. What remains is endurance, patience, the simple task of holding on until the world warms again. William continues his work at the manor house, though the urgency has diminished now that the immediate crisis has passed. The grain he earns supplements the family's stores, building a small reserve against whatever challenges remain. Agnes resumes her full duties, spinning and cooking and managing the household with renewed energy. The children, sensing the change in their parents' mood, become livelier, their games noisier, their laughter more frequent. The signs of approaching spring accumulate slowly. A day arrives when the temperature rises above freezing for the first time in months, and the snow begins, almost imperceptibly, to melt. The icicles that have hung from the thatch since December begin to drip, then to fall, leaving dark patches on the white ground below. The frozen surface of the well cracks and breaks, making water easier to draw. The animals sense the change as well. The cow, which has been lethargic through the worst of winter, becomes more active, her appetite increasing as her body prepares for the demands of spring. The surviving chickens begin to lay more frequently, their eggs a welcome addition to the family's diet. Even the pig, confined to its lean-to for months, seems restless, eager to return to the freedom of the yard. And then, one morning in late February, William hears a sound he has not heard in months. Bird song. A single bird, returned early from wherever birds go in winter, singing from a branch of the oak tree near the cottage. The song is thin and tentative, barely audible over the dripping of melting snow, but it carries a message that needs no translation. Winter is ending. Spring is coming. Life continues. The final weeks of winter pass in a strange combination of hope and hardship. The days grow longer and warmer, but the stores grow shorter, and the family must still ration carefully to ensure they last until fresh food becomes available. The snow melts gradually, revealing a landscape that seems both familiar and strange after months of white. The paths that connect the village reappear, muddy and rutted but passable. The fields emerge from their blanket, sodden and bare but ready for the plow. William begins to think about the spring planting, calculations of a different kind from those that occupied him through the winter. How much seed grain remains? Which strips should be planted first? When will the ground be dry enough to work? These are the questions of life rather than survival, of growth rather than mere endurance, and he welcomes them as signs that the worst is truly over. The first green shoots appear in late March, tiny points of color that seem impossibly vivid after months of white and brown and gray. The children spot them first, racing back to the cottage with the news, and the whole family ventures out to see. There, in the sheltered corner of the garden where the sun strikes earliest, the first herbs of spring are pushing through the soil. Agnes kneels in the mud, touching the shoots with something like reverence, and William sees tears on her cheeks. The village comes back to life as the weather warms. Neighbors who have been isolated for months emerge to survey the damage of winter and begin repairs. The priest announces plans for Easter services, the great celebration of resurrection that marks the end of the penitential season. The Lord's steward begins organizing the spring labor, the plowing and sowing that must be completed before the season advances too far. The Ashfords have survived. They have lost weight, all of them, their clothes hanging loose on frames that were never robust to begin with. They have used up nearly all their stores, the carefully accumulated provisions of autumn reduced to scraps and crumbs. They have endured cold and hunger and fear and isolation, the full weight of a medieval winter pressing down on them for months on end. But they have survived. The family that gathered around the hearth in November, worried but hopeful, gathers again in April, thinner but intact. William and Agnes and Edmund and Alice and Thomas, all five of them, alive and recovering, ready to face whatever the new season brings. The spring that follows is busy beyond measure. The fields must be plowed and planted, the garden tended, the animals cared for, the cottage repaired after the damage of winter. William works from dawn to dusk and beyond, his body slowly regaining the strength that winter depleted. Agnes manages the household with her usual efficiency, stretching the last of their stores until fresh food becomes available, then gradually rebuilding the reserves that will see them through the next winter. The children grow, as children do, putting on weight and height as the food improves and the weather warms. Thomas's cough finally disappears with the coming of spring, and he runs through the fields with an energy that seemed impossible just weeks ago. Alice helps her mother in the garden, learning the names and uses of herbs that will one day be her responsibility. Edmund works alongside his father in the fields, his strength increasing daily, his knowledge of farming deepening with each task. The village, too, recovers. The bonds that were tested by winter's scarcity prove resilient, and the community that emerged from the cold months is in some ways stronger than the one that entered them. Debts are repaid, favors remembered, relationships renewed. The shared experience of survival creates connections that will endure through the seasons to come. And yet, even as spring unfolds in all its promise, the memory of winter lingers. William finds himself looking at the woodpile, already thinking about next year's fuel. Agnes sets aside a portion of every harvest, building stores against the hunger that will inevitably return. The children, young as they are, have learned lessons about scarcity and endurance that will shape their characters for life. This is the rhythm of medieval existence, the endless cycle of seasons that governs every aspect of life. Spring follows winter, as surely as winter follows autumn. But each winter must be survived anew, and there is never any guarantee of success. The Ashfords know this in their bones, as their parents knew it and their grandparents before them. They do not expect life to be easy or safe or predictable. They expect only to endure, to work, to hope, and to trust in God and each other. The summer that follows the hard winter of 1342 is good, blessed with adequate rain and sufficient sun, and the harvest is abundant. The Ashfords' strips yield more than they have in years, and for once there is enough to meet their obligations, enough to set aside for winter, enough to feel something approaching security. William allows himself to hope that the coming winter will be easier, that the stores will last, that the family will not face the desperation they knew this past year. But hope in medieval England is always tempered by experience. William has seen good years followed by bad, abundance followed by scarcity, life followed by death. He knows that the wheel of fortune turns constantly, raising some and lowering others according to patterns that no human can predict or control. All he can do is work and prepare and pray, and trust that whatever comes, his family will face it together. The autumn arrives, and with it the familiar rhythm of harvest and preparation. The grain is cut and gathered, the animals assessed and some selected for slaughter, the stores accumulated against the winter to come. The Ashfords work through the golden days of September and October, racing against the shortening light to complete the tasks that will determine their fate in the months ahead. And as the first frost whitens the fields, and the first chill creeps into the cottage, the family gathers once again around the hearth. The fire burns, the smoke rises, the familiar smells of wood and pottage fill the air. Outside, the world begins its slow descent into winter, the cycle repeating, as it has repeated for generations beyond counting. William looks at his family in the firelight. Agnes with her spinning, Edmund nearly a man now, Alice growing into her mother's image, Thomas no longer a baby but a boy with his own thoughts and dreams. They have survived one winter together, and they will survive others. They will face hunger and cold and fear, and they will endure. They will tell stories, and sing songs and pray prayers, and they will find moments of joy, even in the darkest seasons. They will live as their ancestors lived, and as their descendants will live, bound to the land and the seasons and each other. The fire crackles and sparks, sending tiny points of light up toward the smoke-blackened thatch. Outside, the wind begins to rise, carrying the first hint of snow. Winter is coming again, as it always comes, as it always will, and the Ashford family, huddled together in their small cottage, will meet it as they have always met it, with work and hope and love, and the stubborn determination to see another spring. The wheel of the year turns on, carrying the Ashfords and their village and their world through seasons beyond counting. The winter of 1342 becomes a memory, then a story told to children, then a faint echo in the minds of grandchildren who never knew the people who lived it. Other winters come, some harder, some easier, each one a test to be passed or failed. Other families gather around other hearths, facing the same ancient challenges with the same ancient resources of courage and community. In the grand sweep of history, the Ashfords are invisible, unrecorded in any chronicle, unmarked by any monument, forgotten as completely as if they had never existed. They left no writings, built no buildings, accomplished nothing that the wider world would notice or remember. They were simply people, ordinary people, living ordinary lives in an age that offered little room for anything else. And yet their lives mattered. They mattered to each other, to the children they raised and the neighbors they helped, and the community they sustained. They mattered to the land they worked, the fields they plowed, the crops they grew. They mattered to the great chain of existence that connects past to present to future. Each generation receiving life from those who came before and passing it on to those who come after. The cottage where the Ashfords lived has long since crumbled back into the earth from which it was built. The village of Thornwick, if it ever existed outside imagination, has vanished as completely as the family itself. The fields they worked have been enclosed and divided and built upon, transformed beyond recognition by centuries of change. Even the landscape has shifted, woods cleared and planted, streams diverted, the very contours of the land altered by human hands. But something remains, something persists, through all the changes, all the centuries, all the transformations that separate their world from ours. The fundamental human experiences that shape the Ashfords lives the need for warmth, for food, for shelter, for love, for community, for meaning remain as central to existence now as they were then. The hearth around which they gathered has been replaced by radiators and furnaces, but the need it served remains. The stores they carefully accumulated have given way to refrigerators and supermarkets, but the fear of scarcity still haunts human dreams. The community that sustained them through crisis has evolved into forms they could never have imagined, but the need for connection, for mutual support, for belonging, remains as urgent as ever. We are, in ways we rarely acknowledge, the descendants of the Ashfords, and countless families like them. Not necessarily in blood, though many of us carry genes that passed through medieval peasant villages, but in spirit, in the accumulated wisdom of survival that has been transmitted across generations. The knowledge of how to endure, how to hope, how to find joy in small things and meaning in daily routines, how to face darkness with the faith that light will return. This knowledge did not appear from nowhere. It was earned, painfully and slowly, by people who had no choice but to learn it or perish. The winter nights are shorter now, for most of us, and warmer. The hunger that gnawed at the Ashfords through those long months is, for many, only a metaphor. The isolation that confined them to their cottage is, in an age of instant communication, almost impossible to imagine. We have solved, or at least mitigated, many of the problems that made their lives so precarious. And yet we still gather, in our own ways, around our own hearths. We still tell stories to our children, still mark the turning of the year with rituals and celebrations, still find comfort in the presence of those we love. We still face winters of the spirit, seasons of darkness and difficulty that test our endurance and reveal our character. We still depend on community, on the bonds of mutual support that make survival possible. We still hope for spring. The Ashfords would not understand our world, could not comprehend the technologies and institutions and ideas that shape our existence, but they would recognize something in us, something fundamental and unchanging, something that connects their lives to ours across the vast gulf of time. They would recognize the love between parents and children, the warmth of a fire on a cold night, the satisfaction of work completed, the comfort of familiar routines. They would recognize the fear of loss and the hope for better days, the grief that comes with death, and the joy that comes with new life. In the end, what the Ashfords teach us is not how to survive a medieval winter. That knowledge is, for most of us, purely academic. What they teach us is something more profound and more enduring, that human beings have always faced challenges, have always found ways to endure, have always discovered meaning and purpose and even happiness in circumstances that might seem impossible. They teach us that the resources we need to face our own winters, whatever form those winters take, lie not in technology or wealth or power, but in the simple, ancient, inexhaustible wells of human courage, human connection, and human hope. The fire burns low now, the coals glowing red in the darkness of the cottage. The Ashford family sleeps, huddled together under their worn blankets, breathing the smoky air that has been the breath of home for generations. Outside, the snow falls silently, covering the village in white, and the stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own small victories and defeats, its own moments of fear and hope. But for now, in this moment, there is peace. There is warmth. There is the quiet certainty that whatever comes, they will face it together, as families have always faced the darkness, waiting for the light to return.